Hey everybody, John Thompson here from SAGA Wisdom. We're here on a field trip today with my good buddy John Foster, geologist extraordinaire. He gives one heck of a good outcrop trip. He's going to walk us through this neighborhood and we're going to take a look at the Cardium.
Behind me is Mount MNesca, as you can see over on that side. Very beautiful, very scenic, part of the Rocky Mountains, part of the front ranges of the Rocky Mountains, but in addition, very geologically significant. So to set the scene for where we're going to go today and see some of the rocks that we're going to see today, we're going to see some interesting parts of the Cardium, not only from a stratigraphic or internal structure standpoint, but also from a broad scale structure. And just what the mountains has done to the Cardium in this part of the world, in this close to the front ranges. So Mount MNesca, very popular with hikers, an amazing hike if you haven't done it, I highly recommend it. Super fun on the scree slope. Geologically speaking though, you can almost notice that line right at the base of Mount MNesca where the trees stop, where the scree slope starts, and it's a horizontal flat line if you follow the trees. And that flat line nosedives to my left, or your left, down into the tree line. That shape isn't coincidental. That shape is actually the shape of the McConnell thrust, which is the front thrust of the Rocky Mountains, which is the foremost fault that has exposed that surface. There are other subsequent faults which undercut this area, which extend further out into the basin. However, this is the front thrust or the leading thrust. And the McConnell is a very significant thrust. It's not only significant for its size, its geometry, because it is a massive, massive, massive fault, but also for the sheer magnitude of displacement along this fault. So to put it in perspective, what you're looking at in the rocks, the gray rocks just above the fault, going into that more tan color that you can see right at the top. And then at the very, very, very top, in the furthest peak, you see a little bit of a darker stratigraphy there again. This is very indicative of the front ranges of the Rocky Mountains. You'll hear it called the Rocky Mountain Sandwich or the Rocky Mountain Trinity. It's the three dominant formations, the Palliser, the Banff, and the Rundle, that make up the front ranges and give them their very distinctive and, in my opinion, very spectacularly beautiful shape. And here, between this thrust, so what a thrust does, there are many different types of geological faults. Thrusts in particular take older rock and put it on top of newer rock, which means they remove time. Here what we're seeing Cambrian age rocks. Really, really, really old rocks, almost 500 million years old, smacked right on top of the Belly River, which is kind of late Cretaceous area. It's a little younger than 100 million years. So there's about a 400 or so million year gap in that line. And that is quite something. That means these rocks were transported from a long, long ways away. Some estimations of displacement along the McConnell thrust are tens of kilometers, 60, 70 kilometers of displacement along this thrust. It is a gigantic thrust, which makes sense because the Rockies are a very tall, quite gigantic mountain belt. And you can imagine if all the pressure and all the force it took to take this rock and lift it from hundreds of kilometers away and make a mountain out of it. That force and the stresses associated with that force has had a pervasive effect on the basin. It dominates the basin structure, and it is responsible for what we call the monogeocline, or the very distinctive downward slope of the overall shape of the basin. And in addition, if you were to cast your eye at the lighter layers that you can see in the Palliser Formation here, you can see that they're jagged and they're broken and they're bent and they're shifted. So there's internal folding and internal structures. This has had a massive effect on hydrocarbon systems in the basin and exploration and production, both in how you do it and where it works. In the outer foothills and also way off into the basin. Everything is controlled by the stresses that are in this basin. Everything. All the way from the East Basin Duvernay, which is a long, long way away from here, are still influenced by the far field stresses that are created by the Rocky Mountains. Or I should say, by the far field stresses that gave rise to the Rocky Mountains being here. Because the common vernacular is that the mountains create the stress, whereas in actuality, the stress gave rise to the condition to create the mountains. So this is the McConnell thrust. This is beautiful. And it's this geometry, which geologists call a ramp, followed by a flat, which is a ramp flat thrust, which is very indicative of brittle upper crustal structural geology. Very classic, literally textbook area in the Front Ranges in the Rockies that we are right here. And under that thrust, there are very characteristic structures. So we'll see in a few minutes when we head over to observe some of the Cardium, a large scale open fold, which is an antiform structure, which kind of looks like a big dome, and a big dome, about a 600 or 700 meter big dome. And we'll see a very, very characteristic dipping towards the mountains, leveling off, dipping down, a good structure from a system standpoint, from a petroleum system standpoint, because quite often it is those antiformal or anticlinal structures which form traps for hydrocarbons, especially oil, especially blue and hydrocarbons. So irrespective of the particular stratigraphic trap, which may trap oil inside a formation or gas inside a formation, you have a structural trap component as well, which is not only responsible for trapping it, but some of the smaller scale structures that we'll investigate later today are responsible for aiding in its production. So this is a place where I love to start this field trip. A, just because of its straight natural beauty, but B, because of the seemingly insignificant significance of the area. A lot of people don't realize that this is the front, literally the front of the Rocky Mountains right here. And you can even see that on the end, if you imagine, you might actually be tipping right back up again. So if the rock that used to be here is still here today and wasn't eroded away, you might even imagine another ramp going up into another flat. And that's how these things form through the course of the mountains. They're like staircases almost. Massive, massive, massive amounts of pressure and stress as a result, which is important to us. We utilize that fact in our drilling and completions efforts. So all this, what we're seeing right here, is a neat little structure actually. So what you're looking at are different parasequences of the Cardium, and if you look just to the left of that tree there, you can see the really thick, blocky beams that form the really beautiful layered sandstone of the Cardium shore face, right? And it's ever so slightly tipping or dipping to our left-hand side towards the mountains, and that's an important feature of where we are in this part of the outer foothills. But if you look down, and you can see the really thick beams, especially on this outcrop here, they give way to really, really high intensity and high period, thin little beds. And this is indicative of the kind of mid to lower shore face of the Cardium, which is very prolific and gets played everywhere in the basin. Is you have the really thick Cardium shore face, like the very proper shore face that you would imagine when you think shore face, big sandy shore face. You think, Florida and coconut drinks and umbrellas and that kind of thing, and that's what you're looking at with this sort of stuff. Just the very basic offshore equivalent of that. And then as you start to go down through that sequence, even on the scale that we can see, that really thick beam gives way to really thin beams, gives way to very, very, very fast laminated sandy, muddy stuff, gives way to mud and interlaminated mud siltstone at the bottom, even just right there in the span of 30 feet.
I was going to ask you, how many laminations are we talking about per meter?
Thousands.
Thousands.
Yeah, and that number increases as you go down to the muddy stuff. So the muddy silty per meter, thousands and thousands and thousands, multiple thousands. And then you get up into centimeter scale beds, you can have 100, 200, and then you get up into kind of meter scale, up at the very, very top. Right, like the very top of what you're seeing there maybe has 2, maybe 3 beds. So they're about 20, 25 centimeters thick each. right?
Would this be considered reservoir rock?
This would be a beautiful reservoir rock. Especially that sandy stuff would be amazing reservoir rock. And historically, that's what's been played in the Cardium, is that reservoir, that classical Cardium reservoir. It's been played for 60 years. People have been drilling and producing out of this stuff.
Do they include that silty stuff at the bottom?
Nowadays we do, right? I think because of advances in drilling technology and completion technology in particular, it's allowed us to access the resource that is encapsulated in that layer, in that kind of facies, what geologists call facies, or a group of similar rock. And in many cases, actually, especially in legacy fields that have been played for a long time, decades even, it is accessing that layer that's allowing us to go back into those fields and recapitalize on resources that were missing the first time, and access resources that are there that we couldn't access historically. Pembina is a great example of that. Pembina Williston Green, very, very classic Cardium, has been played for about 60 years. People are actually going back now, companies are going back now and accessing that muddy layer for two benefits. A, there is hydrocarbon resource down there that they're now accessing.
So they're landing there, or
they're landing
there?
Both, landing and fracking there. They're drilling their wells there, which previously that would have been sub-economic. Not only would have been sub-economic, that would have been an outlandish thought decades ago to actually purposefully drill in that rock. Even within the span of my career, I can remember people saying, you're never going to drill that rock. And then you go to actually drilling that rock for two benefits. You access the hydrocarbons that are stored in that rock.
Yeah.
And more importantly, through fracturing, especially multi-stage fracturing, you can fracture up into the classic reservoir, into the better rock, without actually having to drill into better rock.
So
counter some of the pressure problems that are in that rock.
How many meters of pay thickness are we talking about if you added it all together?
Depending on where you are and depending on the particular architecture. And this is one of the beauties of the Cardium, is the Cardium is what geologists call a pro-grading shore face, or it's a shore face that's been layered on top of itself multiple times. From one wellbore and fracking up and down in both directions, or in three-dimensional space actually, you can access multiple Cardium cycles, which means you can access multiple potential shore faces of the Cardium. So, I mean, you're dealing with all set total 10 plus to 20 total meters of really good high net effective pay. Right. It's a very nice reservoir that way. And it's that stacked nature that makes the economics work so well. But I mean, even where we are right now, we're a little bit closer, but across the river right here, you can see that it's much nicer. It's significantly transitioned from where we were up in the woods with that ratty outcrop. And even this outcrop that you see on this point, you see that light tan kind of buff color, very thick sandstone, very quickly comes down into this little bench here where you see this first set of rapids, that you come into this high frequency bedding of kind of it's characteristic of the middle Cardium, middle lower Cardium, as you start to transition from the really thick sandstones down to the really thin, muddy, laminated, very, very quickly interbedded kind of muddy stones, which is what we're standing on right here. This is very, very fine-grained, silty material. It's highly weathered right now, so it kind of obscures some of that character. But if we come down a little closer to the water line, still staying away from the water, you can see the nature of some of these beds start to change. We start to get into very fine-grained stuff with these, what geologists call lag deposits. And they're almost like small little conglomerate beds, right? Intermixed with these banded iron rusted rocks here. And what these are indicative of, these rocks that have these little pebble conglomerates or collections of small little pebbles and grains, these are indicative of very quickly moving waters and very quickly moving water levels. So as sea level would rise, local sea level would rise, or as local sea level would fall, you would get waters rushing over and different depositional systems rushing over older depositional systems, or eroding out depositional systems. And that's where you get these transgressive lags. especially in areas where the sea level transgresses upon the water line, and the sea is literally churning and stirring up previously laid down rocks that were semi-cemented or cemented and forming these lag deposits. You see these a lot in the Cardium. In the old gas Cardium plays, these were really good. These were what were considered speed zones, because they have massive porosity permeability. And for gas, which is very, very transmissible, these things were great. That's why the so-called Cardium conglomerate play has always been a gas target, more so than an oil target, because of the speed and producibility of these rocks. These are very, very, very nice rocks.
Now this is exposed, so oxidization would make it nice and shiny red. Are these iron-based minerals that are in the reservoir? Are they problematic in any way?
Correct, yeah. These would be siderites, and you can get these siderite nodules or bands or beds that form in the Cardium and give you these like rusted weather appearance here. So these are iron-rich, essentially quartz, and they're all, I can't find a loose one at the moment, but these ones here, they can present a problem, but they're non-predictable. That's the issue. You can't predict where they are, the size or extent.
What about,
and they're almost semi-ubiquitous, but your drill bit can bang off of these and you'll experience, an uncontrolled change in azimuth or depth, or some frac fluids can interact with these as well.
I was going to ask you about that. Other than the drill bit, when we're talking about completion fluid design, a lot of people think about the Cardium as one of the higher permeability unconventional plays out there.
It is.
Higher permeability, and as a result of that, usually you start thinking about not slick water jobs, but these hybrid or crosslink or gel jobs, where you're dealing with higher mesh sizes. And I'm wondering about compatibility issues when I see iron-based mineralogy. That iron and, as you know, and polymers don't generally react very well.
They don't like each other.
They don't like each other. So is that an issue when it comes to optimal fluid design?
It can be, but less of an issue than you think. Reason being is if you were to look at this band, it's actually very limited in extent. So we're standing on a surface which is dipping in this direction. So the overall thickness of this band is really only a couple centimeters. In terms of a slick water job, or in terms of a crosslink hybrid job or a viscous fluid job, these can pose an issue, and they can deflect some of your frac, and the chemistries can interact, so you need to use a nice neutral kind of a fluid. But in terms of being detrimental, I don't think they're detrimental, because these things are everywhere. They're ubiquitous in the Cardium. Every Cardium outcrop you'll see has them. Even looking across the river, you can see areas that are rusty, and rust literally looks like it's weeping out of the rock, and that's these bands and nodules. So that it's very, very limited. And if you think about it, what we're standing on right now is limited to this dip surface. So if you were to roll in with a very viscous gel, a linear gel or a polymer-based frac fluid that has the ability to generate a lot of high net pressure and generate a lot of frac height, then you'll be able to bypass some of these things. They're also very limited in their 3D extent, in their aerial extent. So we can see it on this surface, but if we were to go over to the other side of the river, we might have an actual challenge in finding this particular band in this particular stratal level. There may be others in different stratigraphy or different stratigraphic levels, but this particular one is usually very limited in its three-dimensional size.
So it must make drilling very difficult to stay in the sweet spot.
If you hit one, it can be. That's why when you're drilling in the Cardium, sometimes you experience these uncontrolled changes in either azimuth, you're drilling left-right, or your depth, you're drilling up-down. Because literally it's a high potential that the bit just bangs off of this stuff. And you can see little trace evidence of it in the cuttings as well, that you are drilling through these, these more iron-rich areas. So very interesting structure. Remember a little while ago, we were saying how this bed surface is dipped towards the mountains, right? In that kind of an area. Well, if you were to think about the upper part of this sandstone, it's often described as a big, thick sandstone or quartz-rich beam, kind of like a 2x4. And if you were to take a stack of 2x4s and you were to try to bend those, if they're nailed together, they're not going to bend very easily. But if they can move and they can slip relative to one another with what geologists refer to as faults or accommodation faults or slip structures, what you end up with is you end up with a surface like this. And these lines that you see trailing down here are lines of mineralization that form as surfaces move relative to one another. These are what geologists call slickensides. And these slickensides will tell you that this top surface has moved relative to this bottom surface in this direction. So as this beam was composed of several 2x4s, to use an analogy, and it started bending and bending and bending and bending, these individual 2x4s started slipping relative to one another, next to one another. And in this case, you can feel in the mineralization that it's rougher in one direction than it is in the other. So because of that roughness and smoothness in each direction, I can tell you that this top rock has slipped down in that direction relative to this bottom rock. This is a very small scale illustration of even larger scale faults. Big tectonic continental scale faults behave in the exact same way with the exact same mechanics and the exact same mathematics that describe them. It's just a difference in scale. So whereas this fault here may only have tens of centimeters of displacement across it to accommodate this rock being bent into an overall, arc shape, or what geologists call an antiform shape. This process is the exact same process that we will see in the McConnell thrust, which is the front thrust of the Rocky Mountains, which is responsible for lifting a large part of the front ranges where we are up to its current height and current geometry that we see today. And these are the exact same processes which govern this as which govern that, which we saw when we looked at the McConnell thrust. Very interesting. This one's been weathered out quite a lot. It's hard to feel, but this white mineralization right here, you can actually still feel the bidirectional nature, that it's much rougher in this direction than it is in that direction. So this is actually kind of cool. This is further supported by some of these thin little fractured mineralizations that we see across this really thick interbedded sandstone here. So that's actually kind of neat. I like that. And the thing that I'd like to point out to you on this outcrop surface here is that there's two, maybe even three, somewhat dominant directions. There's a dominant direction this way, which is kind of running northwest, southeast, and there's what geologists call the conjugate or the associated direction, which is running at roughly a 60 or so degree angle to that main fracture set. And it's those interchangeable fracture sets, or those conjugate fracture sets, which are dominated by far field stresses in this basin. And they line up roughly with the basin, with the edge of the mountains, and they're controlled by the edge of the mountains. You have two sets. One set is roughly parallel to the edge of the mountains, and another set is roughly at 50 degrees from north, which points directly out, radiates out from the Rocky Mountains. And those are all controlled by far field stresses. Locally in a reservoir, and when you look at this rock locally, you can see that there are fracture orientations which run counter to those two dominant directions. There's another one which runs in this direction, which is almost 50 degrees from the other side. It cuts off some of the original fractures. That may be related to local stresses that were applied to this rock as the rock was being exhumed and brought to surface. It may be related to local weathering that happened on the surface, or it may be such that that is a subdominant direction of fractures and faults that can be expressed and tied to the subsurface. In the Cardium, again, the two dominant directions, the dominant fracture direction is 50 degrees, and then you will have 60 degrees off of that 50 degrees, you'll have your other subdominant direction, which is kind of what we're seeing illustrated in this outcrop right now. It's a very neat study. And you can even see, looking from one part of the outcrop to another, that the relative densities. This is also another question you hear about when you think about fracturing and faulting in a reservoir at depth, is what's the intensity, the fracturing intensity, or how many fractures per square meter can you have and what's their distribution? A lot of people believe that fractures are somewhat bimodal in a sense that they occur in swarms or they can occur dispersed. I think in reality, It's a mixture between the two. It's basically a continuum between those two. A continuum between being totally pervasively fractured and discrete fracture swarms. And a lot of that will be controlled by the structural characteristics of the rock or the mechanical characteristics of the rock, which can be termed as rheology. You'll hear that term quite a lot, which is just a term that describes the mechanical characteristic or mechanical makeup of the rock. And if you think about this surface that we're looking at, it's a neat microcosm in a way, because we have this edge which shows a lot of fracturing, centimeters apart fracturing. And then we have a section in the middle which has tens of centimeters, even a meter between each discrete joint or discrete fracture. And then we have another area over here that, again, you're back into that tens of centimeter fracture, parallel fracturing. So in a small scale, what we're envisioning is a fracture swarm, a couple of fractures, and then a fracture swarm. So if you were to imagine your wellbore drilling through this, you could potentially see these fracture swarms in your drilling data through either standpipe pressures or back-end pressures, annular pressures.
What about rate of penetration?
Rate of penetration may increase, depends on if the fracture is filled or unfilled. You could see fluid losses as you drill through these things. Faults are especially notorious for fluid losses, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, it's bad losing your fluid, and you need to take steps to make sure that your wellbore integrity is preserved when that happens. However, faults, in my experience, especially drilling wells in the outer foothills, can act as super highways for production, both gas and or oil. And if you can find these naturally fractured zones, the conventional wisdom is that's where you want to put your stimulation. And there's evidence to the contrary that that's actually where you don't want to put your stimulation.
It's already stimulated.
It's already stimulated.
Yeah.
You're just going to see a lot of leak off in that. Now, if you have pervasively cemented fractures or faults, that could actually be a really good candidate for re-stimulation or stimulation in the first place.
They need a little energy to pop open.
Need a little energy to pop open, but it's already a plane of weakness that you can exploit. So nature has done so much for us. Nature has bent this rock. Nature has busted it up. It's cracked it up. It's made it move next to each other. It's done the best fracture job that we could ever hope to do. And as an industry or as a science, we're actually not that great at fracturing. But what we are great at is propping. That's the secret that we have that nature very rarely displays, is the ability to keep these fractures open and turn them into production pathways.
How many wells would you say in the Cardium you've drilled in your background from BP and Shell and
Oh my
West?
goodness. Many, many, many. Tens of dozens and dozens of wells I've drilled in the Cardium through the years. Luckily, I've been very fortunate. I've been very blessed in my career to this point that I've always been on really active teams, active drilling teams and active exploration teams and active development teams. And I've got to actually put wellbores down in quite a few formations. And it's been really fun because they're all different. And even the same formation, even the Cardium. The Cardium's not the Cardium's not the Cardium. The Cardium in one place can be vastly different than the Cardium in another place. And it's related to that stacked shore face architecture. Depending on if you're really close to the beach or really close to deep water, the Cardium can actually have a very different expression and behave differently. And then you layer the structural component on top of that. Is it faulted? Is it folded? How close are you to the mountains? What's your local state of strain? All those things come into play, especially on the production scale.
Well, you were saying earlier that some of the Cardium that you like is that umbrella drink sort of beach sandy Cardium.
Oh yeah, beautiful Cardium.
What's a good example of that? Where would you find that? Like you talk Willie Green, you talk all these different areas.
Pembina has beautiful Cardium shore face that way. Beautiful, beautiful Cardium shore face. It's really thick. Up around Grand Cache as well. It's really thick. Beautiful sandstone. And there's even areas where some of that sand hasn't been played. And you potentially have bypassed or virgin reservoir conditions in some of those, or near to that. Those are beautiful reservoirs. The issue you run into, or not so much an issue, but the consideration you have to take is how much of that is already been produced. Because it's such a great reservoir, you could very quickly find yourself in a depleted reservoir situation.
Transmissibility is good, yeah.
Which is Pembina, all over is Pembina. So this, what we're looking at here, is a really great example of the lower silty, muddy facies in the Cardium. This has been exposed on this riverbed here for quite some time, which is why it's so crumbly in nature. But you can see that this is a fundamentally different rock than the rocks that we were just looking at. Gone are the big thick beams. Towards the top of the outcrop here, we can see there's some isolated sandstone beds that mix in between these two, centimeters on scale, but they're encapsulated in this silty, muddy rock. And usually when you see little bits of sandstone, they're in these little lenses here. They're centimeter to sub-centimeter scale beds or lamination. And if you look down here, this is one of these isolated, somewhat isolated sandstone lenses or beds that I was talking about. It's all fractured and it's very, very crumbly because the rheology of this rock is it's very friable, which means it's very easily broken and crumbled. This is weathered, of course, from being exposed to water, exposed to the river, exposed at the surface of the earth. But even in the subsurface, it is this material that people are now drilling in. And at companies that I've worked for and in my career, I can remember going from the transition from even vertical wells in the Cardium to horizontal wells in the Cardium to horizontal wells in the Cardium landed in this type of rock. And that's a fundamental step change or game changer for the Cardium, because it now takes this play, which in the past has been plagued with pressure problems and long drilling and very expensive wells, and you can now drill in this, which you can imagine is significantly easier to drill, right? So you'll see an economic benefit by drilling in this, and you're still within relative proximity to the rocks that we were just looking at. I mean, we walked then for, what, 4 minutes, and we came down we transitioned from that middle upper part of the shore face where you're dominated by your coconut drinks and your sandy beaches, and we've transitioned into this muddy material, which, if you want to use the same analogy, if you've ever been snorkeling offshore in a place like California or Florida, and you're going in and out of these little coves and you see the beach go to cobbles, go to rocks, go to this muddy material that you see ripples and little shrimp and fish and things playing in. This is what we're looking at with this. This is compounded by these through-going fractures, which is interesting because this material is so friable and it's so squishable that you would think that discrete fractures wouldn't be able to exist in the muddy part, but they actually do. You can follow this one, which goes from this sandy lens all the way up through the muddy part, and it starts truncating these tiny little beds, and you can follow it and follow it and follow it, and eventually around here it fizzles out someplace. But this is on the scale of, 1.5 meters. This fracture could be related to exhumation, it could be related to near surface processes, but the fact remains that mechanically it's a through-going fracture that extends from competent, harder material into less competent material. Even if you were to poke this, I can't dissolve this the same way that I can dissolve that. So this is a very interesting kind of lower muddy transition of the Cardium. Very beautiful, actually.
Can you make comments about compositions and clay materials, their presence, their degree?
By and large, the whole thing is quartz dominated. So it'll seem really weird, but this is quartz rich, and so is this. But it's a definite change in grain size, and of course, a corresponding change in clay proportion as well. So the muddier, siltier areas will have a higher percentage of clay than the nice clean parts, of course, because of the relative energy with which they were laid down. The sandy part, the big thick beams we were looking at just a few minutes ago, were laid down in very high energy. That's something that's characteristic of the Cardium, characteristic of actually the basin at that time in the Cretaceous about 100 million years ago. Very, very high energy towards the shore face. It's like modern day California, very similar. California has beautiful sandy beaches because of that energy. This would have been further offshore, a little bit quieter rock. This still would have been subject to storms and all the things that lay down these individual high energy lenses, but by and large, this is a very calm, quiescent kind of a depositional area. So because of that lower energy, it can sustain clay content for much, much longer. Clays will live here, they'll get deposited here. which is good because it makes for nice drilling, makes for easy drilling. Let's go take a look at what you're looking at there, Johnny. Yeah, so what you're looking in here is fracture surfaces, intersecting fracture surfaces actually. So this really long flat portion and this really long flat portion, if you were to measure this angle, it would turn out to be rough. That you can kind of see right here even. It's roughly 60 degrees. This is a great example, an up-close example of what we were looking at on the bedding surface of the very thick sandstones before. This is a good example of it, up-close example of it. And it's the same mechanical features. This is a thicker portion. This is a thicker beam, if you will, encased in the very fine or muddy material that we were just looking at. So this lens, or zone, you might want to call it, would be subject to the same far field stresses as the upper part. The expression would be a little bit different because you essentially have a hard block floating in a very soft material, but you can still see that these things are related to one another. And this is a good analogy for what you see in subsurface. I'm not saying that these fractures individually are present in the subsurface because, again, there's the overprint of exhumation that we see here. However, it's the mechanical similarities between those two areas and between the surface expression and the subsurface expression of the same rock that allow you to draw those correlations between those two. So there seems to be a bimodal distribution of opinion on fractures. Either fractures are everywhere and play an extremely important role, or fractures are nowhere and they don't matter and we frack it all. Whereas I think, again, in reality, it's somewhere in the middle, somewhere in that gray zone where there are fractures and we do see them. And if you can see a fracture or fault in a vertical well, which you can in the Cardium, quite often in the Cardium, you'll see evidence of fracturing in core. And if you think about that core, that one paper towel sized roll of drilling string, if you think that in that square kilometer you were lucky enough to hit the only fracture or the only fault, then I think you're going down the garden path. The fact that you see it in vertical cores, not even deviated cores, attests to the pervasive fractured network that is present in the subsurface in situ right now, which contributes to production. And this is a known fact of the Cardium. People have been exploiting that and, in fact, counting on that for years and years and years. And there's no reason to think that that can't extrapolate to other formations, such as the Duvernay in K-Bob or Willie Green, or the East Basin Duvernay, which is a slightly different rock, but shares the same name. Or the Montney, for example. The Montney is a gigantic beam of quartz-dominated material that is pervasively fractured just about everywhere. And even within the Montney, there are high fracture zones and low fracture zones, high fault zones and low fault zones. So there's quite a bit of heterogeneity even in that, despite the fact that it's often touted as a monotonous or boring kind of sand or quartz-dominated system. It's actually, on a small scale, quite complex and quite fun. Same thing with the Cardium.
The monotony.
The monotony, yeah. The so-called monotony. So, Johnny Thompson just pointed out, had a very interesting question, and he said, well, is what we're seeing here, this muddy thing that we're seeing here, also present on the other side of the river? And it absolutely is. So if we were to look across the other side of the river, you'll notice, even at first glance, between the left-hand side and the right-hand side, there's a difference in color. You can see that right off the bat. These rocks are significantly darker than those rocks. And if you think in your mind's eye to what we were just saw over in the big, thick, nice Cardium, those rocks were quite light in color. And those rocks, the really friable, muddy stuff, is very dark in color. And that's what we're seeing here. So if you start on the right, just below the very top where we see the trees, we can actually still see some of that interbedded, interlaminated, thicker sandstone, which is moving towards the top of the Cardium formation. And you can follow those layers down and down and down to the edge of the water. But in your mind's eye, continue what we see on the left side under the water, because it all layers up just like a layer cake, just like a cake. You can follow those layers of cake down and down and down. So as we move from right to left, we're actually moving down in stratigraphy or backwards in time to how these rocks were deposited and laid down. When these rocks were deposited, all this muddy stuff would have been deposited first, and everything younger would have been deposited on top of it. So we would have been moving from the muddy offshore in our California example when we're snorkeling into the beautiful beach with our coconut drinks in the California example. And this is, you know, on the order of 20 meters, total, real, true thickness of 20 meters, which is very, very common for a Cardium parasequence or one of these shore face, middle shore face, lower shore face sandwiches that we see in the Cardium. And this is a nice little microcosm of it, right around where the dam control office is, in the dam control room. So that was a great question, Johnny. So to answer your question, yes, what we're seeing, this dark material does transfer over here. Not only does it transfer over here, it goes under the river and directly underlies a lot of the really beautiful sandstone that we were just walking across and had the pleasure to look at. So what we're seeing here is a very interesting transition of the rocks. So the rocks here have changed yet again. And they've gone from dipping towards the mountains to dipping away from the mountains. So what we've seen is we've seen the rocks dip towards, we've seen them flatten out, and we've seen them dip away, which in geological terminology is a fold. And this is a very big, broad, open fold in the Cardium, immediately underlying the front thrust of the Rocky Mountains. And these rocks were buckled and folded as the mountains were getting pushed up. And it's these things that you will encounter in structured types of the Cardium, or interlayered or even mildly disturbed areas in the Cardium. You don't need to be this close to the mountains to see broad, upright, or even asymmetric folding. And if you think about the scale that we've been walking on, we've only been walking for the sake of 600-700 meters, maybe, downstream. And we've seen different lithologies, and we've seen different structural domains, different structural regimes, different parts of the fold, all within about the scale of half an average wellbore. So this is one of the nice places of this area, is you can see all these things in a really, really short order and give you an appreciation for scale. So if you were to think about a wellbore being twice that length, then you could easily drill across a fold or two. And all through those natural fractures, and all through that change in lithology, all in the scale of a single wellbore.
And you were saying earlier
you routinely do.
You can pick that up probably on some of your drilling data, I imagine.
That you can. So you can pick it up on kind of routine customary data like a gamma ray log. You'll be able to see your gamma ray cleaning up or getting dirty, or to put it in the scale of what we just saw, getting closer to that muddy lower part and further away from that muddy lower part. You can see potentially drops in pressure, drops in fluid, that sort of thing, as you pass by fracture swarms or small scale faults. All these things they're cryptic, but they're hidden in the data.
Have you ever worked for an operator that take use of that data and try to use it to design engineered completions?
Absolutely, I have, yeah. And a geologist is actually quite instrumental in that data analysis in conjunction with their friendly neighborhood engineer. Usually a reservoir engineer and a completion engineer.
So if the interpretation is I've hit a fracture swarm, I ease up on the stimulation?
Yeah, you may skip that stage, right? You may, if you're in a multi-stage completion, you may blank that. If you're in like a plug and perf type of a scenario, you may not put a completion there, or you may just simply perf it and then not stimulate it, or put in a very modest stimulation, shall we say, just to see past the damage zone.
During your drilling days, were you around to see a shift from plug and perf to, say, more of these sliding sleeve or cemented single point entry completion types get introduced?
I have, actually. I've seen just about just about everything, which sounds a little interesting. But I've seen plug and perfs, I've seen sliding sleeves, I've seen slotted liners, all of those different technologies be employed. And it's really a right tool for the right job. And it's very dependent on the formation.